Kash Patel mocks black excellence. Denzel Washington's quiet response goes viral. It all began inside a grand conference hall in the heart of New York City. The occasion was one of the most anticipated of the year, an international summit on culture, the arts, and global leadership. The guest list sparkled with former heads of state, legendary athletes, celebrated filmmakers, and voices from across the creative spectrum. But all eyes were drawn to one polarizing figure the moment he entered the room: Kash Patel, a former government official known for his controversial statements and unfiltered rhetoric. Cameras trailed him, and his stiff posture and practiced smile made it clear he had come to make an impression. Just a few seats down, almost unnoticed at first, sat Denzel Washington. He wasn't there as a political figure or even a headline name on the program. He had been invited as a representative of American film and as a cultural ambassador, someone who, through his work, had helped bridge divides and elevate voices. Denzel hadn't come to confront anyone. His role was simple: deliver an inspiring message about how storytelling and cinema can bring people together across borders and identities. But not even he could have predicted what would unfold. Minutes into the event, one of the moderators invited Kash Patel to the stage to speak about leadership in challenging times. Kash eagerly stepped up, adjusted the mic, and began with a barrage of talking points: criticisms of woke culture, complaints about media bias, and praise for his time in government. Nothing out of the ordinary, until he paused and scanned the crowd. Then, with a mocking grin, he dropped the line that would ignite everything. "I see Hollywood royalty is in the room. Denzel Washington, am I right? Nothing says unity like another privileged actor lecturing us from his mansion. But hey, at least he can cry on cue." There was a beat of stunned silence, a few awkward chuckles, but mostly a room frozen mid-breath. Denzel didn't react. He didn't raise an eyebrow or shift uncomfortably. He simply turned his head slowly toward the stage and fixed his gaze on Patel. Calm, centered, unmoved. But that look, that quiet, knowing stare, carried more weight than 100 words. It wasn't anger, it wasn't shock. It was disappointment, deep, layered, and unwavering. He wouldn't respond, not yet. Not with outrage, not with insults. He had something else in mind. And when the time came, it would echo far beyond that room. Meanwhile, Kash Patel continued his speech, oblivious to the tension rippling through the crowd. Phones came out, texts were sent, videos began rolling. Attendees whispered and exchanged glances, not about Patel's words, but about Denzel's silence. A Canadian journalist, seated 2 rows back, instinctively turned her lens toward Washington. She zoomed in. Click. That silent, steady gaze, composed, profound, was caught on camera. And within hours, it would be seen by millions. A reaction without words, yet thunderously clear. At Denzel's side sat a woman from the organizing team, a quiet volunteer who had spent years working on cultural outreach projects in underserved communities across America. She leaned slightly toward him and whispered with care, "Denzel, I'm so sorry for what he said. It was disrespectful." He gave a soft nod, expression still calm. The truth was, comments like those, no matter how offensive, no longer ignited the fire in him the way they once might have. Age, wisdom, and decades in the public eye had taught him that real strength isn't in how loud you react, but in how powerfully you choose your moment. And in that moment, as Kash Patel stepped off the stage with a self-satisfied grin, Denzel had already made his decision. He would respond, but not then. Not with anger, not with insults. He would answer with something stronger: his voice, his story, and his truth. It wouldn't be revenge, it would be clarity. And if there was one thing Denzel Washington had learned in a lifetime of walking tall in a world that tried to make him small, it was this: when dignity is under attack, silence is complicity. Meanwhile, in the makeshift press room just off the main stage, journalists were already typing frantically. Some with outrage, others with shock. But a single question echoed across every newsroom and newsroom thread. What will Denzel say? Would he do what so many others had done? Nod politely and let it pass? Or would he be the one to reclaim the space, to restore dignity with measured, powerful words? What no one knew then was that the answer would not only shift the energy in the room, it would ripple across the world. The summit carried on, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The next few speakers sounded hollow, their words drifting in a room now gripped by invisible tension. Everyone was still physically present, but mentally anchored to that moment. The one where a line was crossed, and someone had yet to respond. Denzel remained seated. He hadn't stood up, hadn't stormed out, hadn't even changed his posture. But his face said more than any outburst could have. There was no visible fury, just a quiet depth, the kind of sadness a person carries after witnessing the same disrespect played on repeat for far too long. Not sadness from weakness, but the kind born of restraint, of choosing to speak when it truly matters. Then came the final segment, Culture and Expression, Denzel's scheduled appearance. Originally, his talk was meant to be a light, inspiring message about the power of cinema, the joy of creative collaboration, and how storytelling shaped his upbringing in Mount Vernon. A heartwarming moment to close the day. But the speech had changed, and he knew it. Before taking the stage, Denzel stepped into a side room to sip some water. An event producer found him there, visibly worried. "Mr. Washington," he said quietly, "if you don't feel comfortable speaking after what happened, we completely understand. We can take you off the program." Denzel looked at him, calm and grounded. There was no hesitation in his voice. "No, I'm going to speak, but not the speech I prepared. I'm going to speak for everyone who needed someone to speak." The producer said nothing, just nodded, stepped back, and gave him space. Moments later, the presenter called his name. The room fell still. Some attendees leaned forward. Others whispered. Some saw just the actor, the celebrity, but a few knew something powerful was coming. Denzel walked to the podium slowly with the grace of a man who didn't need to perform to be seen. He didn't wave, he didn't smile, he didn't joke. He placed both hands on the microphone, adjusted it to his height, and stood in silence. Not a single sound, not a phone tapping, not even a footstep backstage. The silence was heavy, yet electric. And just like that, he had their attention. Then, without raising his voice, and with the calm clarity of his natural cadence, Denzel began. "Tonight I was invited to talk about storytelling, but first I need to talk about something deeper. Respect. Because you can't celebrate an art form that brings people together while tolerating words that tear them apart." The room, once restless, fell utterly silent. No phones, no coughs, not even the creak of a chair. Only the sound of one man standing steady behind a microphone. Time, it seemed, had paused. "I was born in Mount Vernon," Denzel continued, "in a neighborhood that didn't always have much, but where we had something stronger than wealth. We had heart, we had community, and we had dreams. Not just for ourselves, but for those around us." He didn't speak with resentment. There was no bitterness in his tone. He spoke like a man who had walked through fire with grace, like someone who had carried the expectations of millions and never once dropped their name in the dust. "No one handed me anything. What I have, I earned, just like the countless men and women I grew up with, who worked double shifts, raised kids, and still found a way to believe in something bigger than themselves." He paused, then looked up, directly at the audience. His voice softened, but his words struck harder. "So when someone, anyone, implies that I'm just another pampered actor preaching from privilege, I don't get angry for myself. I hurt for the grandmother holding her family together with 2 jobs and no spotlight. I hurt for the young black student afraid to speak up because someone already decided who they are. I hurt for the countless voices who built this nation and still get asked to prove their worth." In the front row, Kash Patel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He was used to pushback filled with fire, anger, emotion. He didn't know what to do with dignity, because this wasn't a rant. It was a mirror, held up calmly, powerfully, and without malice. Denzel took a breath, like a man revisiting 1,000 memories in one heartbeat. "America's not perfect, no place is. But our people, they're stronger, more beautiful, and more resilient than the headlines ever show. If you want to know what we're really about, don't watch the news, walk through our neighborhoods, sit at our tables, hear our stories. A few people clapped, hesitant at first, unsure if it was appropriate to interrupt. Then came more and more, until the room trembled with genuine applause, the kind born from something raw and real. But Denzel didn't pause to bask in it. He hadn't come for applause. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was there for one thing only, to reclaim truth with grace. And perhaps what struck the audience the most wasn't what he said, but how he said it. There was no hatred in his tone, only clarity. Only love for the people who shaped him, for the unseen, the underestimated, the unheard. Across my career, he said, his eyes glinting with memory, I've performed in theaters and stadiums across this world, from Europe to Africa, from Harlem to Hollywood. And in every place, I've met incredible people. People of every color, faith, and language. And you know something? He looked across the crowd, his voice steady. I never had to put another culture down, to feel proud of my own. And with that, the entire room held its breath. Not because of shock, but because they knew they had just witnessed something rare. Truth, without anger, conviction, without aggression, power, without volume. That line, I never had to put another culture down to feel proud of my own, fell like a lightning bolt across the room. Several attendees turned their heads openly toward Kash Patel. He sat frozen, jaw tight, arms crossed. Every word Denzel spoke seemed to chip away at the armor of arrogance he had worn so confidently just minutes earlier. But he couldn't leave. He knew it. Walking out now would expose exactly what Denzel's words were dismantling. Pride without depth. He was trapped in a moment of his own making. And Denzel Washington continued, I'm not a politician. Never wanted to be. I'm the son of a Pentecostal minister and a mother who cleaned homes and never once complained. I'm black. I'm American. But above all, maybe I'm human. And if I'm standing here tonight, it's not because of the movies I've made. It's because I've tried in every moment to carry the weight of stories that were never told. His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of memory. He paused, looked down for a moment, and the silence that returned wasn't tense anymore. It was reverent. He looked back up, gentler now. And for those who think the Black American experience is just what you've seen in headlines, I invite you to look us in the eyes. That's where our truth lives. Not in your assumptions, not in your fear, but in our resilience. A spontaneous wave of applause burst through the hall. It wasn't polite, it wasn't planned. It was emotional, raw, uncontainable. Some stood, some wiped away tears. Others reached for their phones to record what they instinctively knew was history in real time. But in the front row, Kash Patel remained seated. Only now no one was looking at him. The spotlight had shifted, and it wasn't going back. All eyes were now on the man in a simple black suit who had managed to do something few ever could. Silence pride with dignity. And still, the applause didn't stop. It swelled into a standing ovation, rising with every second. Diplomats, artists, students, organizers, people of every background stood tall, not for a celebrity, but for a man who had just defended something larger than himself, with the most powerful tool of all, grace. Denzel slowly lowered his gaze, then looked up again and gave a slight nod of thanks. Just enough. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt the emotion. He let the room breathe, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was firmer than before, yet still soft, deeply human. Sometimes we think we have to shout to be heard. But I've learned that when you speak from the heart, even those who don't want to listen still hear you. He paused. Then, ever so subtly, he turned his body just slightly toward the front row, toward Patel, but he didn't look at him with contempt. There was no mockery in his expression. He looked at him as one might look at a man who had lived too long inside his own echo chamber, offering, without ego or anger, a quiet chance to understand. "I didn't come here to correct anyone," he said, eyes sweeping across the room. "I came to remind you, we don't need permission. We need respect. Because behind every face you label, there's a life, a struggle, a legacy." He placed a hand on his chest, then let it drop gently. "And no matter how many times we're underestimated, we rise. We keep rising." By now, many in the room were visibly emotional. Not just Black attendees, but people of all backgrounds. Because deep down, we've all been judged for where we come from. And watching someone defend their origin with such calm, elegant power, it awakens something universal. Meanwhile, outside in the press room, phones were ablaze. Live streams were rolling. Headlines were already spreading. Denzel silences ignorance with a masterclass in dignity. Washington speaks. The world listens. No anger, just truth. What had begun as a careless insult was now something unforgettable. And the most remarkable part? He never once raised his voice. No fist in the air, no victory lap, no smug grin for the cameras. When Denzel stepped away from the podium, he did so like a man walking back into the crowd, not above them, but with them. Because in his eyes, he wasn't the story, he was just the one who finally told it. He stepped down from the podium slowly, as if what he had just done was the most natural thing in the world. As if speaking from the heart wasn't an act of bravery, but a simple matter of conscience. But in the room, it didn't feel ordinary. What Denzel treated as normal had struck others as extraordinary. Some attendees remained standing, visibly moved. Others exchanged glances, struggling to find the right words. It felt as though someone had just broken an invisible chain that had been quietly choking them for years. Denzel returned to his seat, and as he walked down the steps, hands began to reach out, to shake his, to thank him, to simply touch the man who had just spoken on behalf of something larger than himself. He accepted the gestures humbly, without grandness or pride. An African woman, representing an international human rights NGO, approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "You didn't just speak for Black Americans. You spoke for all of us who've been reduced to our accents, our skin, our origins." Denzel clenched his jaw quietly, because what he had felt on that stage, it wasn't personal. It was collective, and that's why his words had traveled so far, so fast. They didn't belong to just one group. They belonged to everyone who'd ever been diminished and kept quiet. Meanwhile, in the front row, Kash Patel remained silent. Gone was the smugness from earlier. What he had heard hadn't been an attack, and yet it had shaken him more than 1,000 insults ever could. He'd been disarmed, not by shouting, but by something far more powerful: respect. Patel had interrupted presidents. He'd mocked journalists. He'd handled confrontation with bluster and control. But this was different. He had been corrected, without being mentioned, defeated, without a fight, exposed, without being named. And it stung. In the sound booth, one of the producers, who had been holding back tears, finally let out a quiet sigh and whispered to a colleague, "That man just saved this entire event, and he didn't even mean to." But what had just happened inside the auditorium was only the beginning, because outside, the world was already on fire. Clips of Denzel's speech, recorded from different angles, were spreading across the internet like a storm no one could stop. Some videos focused tightly on his face, capturing every micro-expression. Others panned across the audience, showing tears, standing ovations, silent awe. One video even captured Kash Patel's face, stiff and unmoving, as the speech unfolded. Platforms lit up: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X. Within an hour, a video posted by a Mexican journalist in the audience had crossed 500,000 shares. Its caption was simple, yet sharp. Denzel Washington gives Kash Patel a masterclass in dignity without saying his name. Comments flooded in, tens of thousands. Many were from African Americans, expressing pride. But the surprise came from around the world. People from India, Nigeria, Japan, Brazil, Germany, South Africa, they all echoed the same feeling. This wasn't just about America. This was for all of us. International headlines followed swiftly. CNN, Denzel Washington's speech redefines grace in global leadership. BBC, Denzel reminds the world that truth doesn't need volume. Al Jazeera, a voice from Hollywood becomes a voice for the voiceless. El País, more than an actor, a conscience. In a small cafe in Atlanta, a young film student watched the clip on her phone while her mother, a retired hospital worker, sat beside her quietly crying. "He didn't just speak for himself," the mother whispered. "He spoke for us, for everyone who's ever been dismissed with a smile." Across modest homes and communities long told they didn't matter, Denzel's words were being received like water in a drought. Not because they were loud, but because they were true. But not everyone was celebrating. Inside a private room at the venue, Patel's aides were in crisis mode. One of them showed him a tablet screen. "It's already at 20 million views." Patel didn't say a word. He simply clenched his jaw. There was no statement he could make that wouldn't look petty. No denial that wouldn't be instantly refuted by video. No counterattack that wouldn't make him look like the villain. He had been silenced by someone who never even raised his voice. And while Patel sulked in silence, he was preparing for what came next. Because this wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about lifting the curtain on something deeper. Something that had for too long remained unspoken. And he wasn't going to do it alone. As the video continued to explode globally, unexpected voices began to join in. Celebrities, activists, writers, athletes, world leaders. Ava DuVernay tweeted, "That wasn't a speech, that was scripture. Thank you, Denzel." LeBron James posted a clip with the caption, "We don't need louder voices, we need braver ones." Viola Davis wrote simply, "Dignity, that's it, that's the post." In just 12 hours across all platforms, the speech had amassed over 100 million views. It was no longer trending. It had become something more, a reckoning. It was becoming more than a moment. It was becoming a symbol, a global reminder that no matter how loud the insulter's microphone may be, the truth, spoken with humility, always carries further. But while the world applauded, Denzel Washington remained silent. He declined interviews. He turned off his phone. He retreated to his hotel room, not in defiance, but in reflection. He hadn't sought attention. He wasn't chasing headlines. He had simply done what he believed was right. Now, watching the scale of the reaction, he didn't feel pride or adrenaline. He felt something heavier, responsibility. Late that night, from the 14th floor window of his midtown hotel, he looked out at the restless lights of New York, his expression burdened. In his hand, he held an old, worn notebook, the kind he'd carried since his early acting days. Inside were quotes, prayers, and thoughts he'd never shared. He turned to a fresh page and wrote quietly, "I didn't speak to be heard. I spoke so they wouldn't feel alone." He closed the notebook, slowly, firmly. Meanwhile, on talk shows and news panels, the world debated what had just happened. Some political analysts called his speech a masterclass in moral courage. Others described it as a powerful reminder of how one voice can confront power without losing its soul. But not everyone saw it that way. A conservative commentator on American TV accused Denzel of emotional manipulation, calling him a Hollywood victim player who used the moment to take down a patriot. But social media wasn't buying it. Clips from the speech were everywhere, and thousands of viewers clapped back with clarity. He didn't attack anyone. He elevated the conversation with more grace than anyone else in that room. In classrooms across the US and abroad, teachers played the speech. Some used it as a teaching moment about dignity, about restraint, about the power of truth told without vengeance. And then, amidst the chaos, a letter arrived at Denzel's hotel suite. No return address, just a single handwritten message on crisp white paper. "Thank you for speaking when others stay silent. The world needed that." He held the paper in his hand for a long time, not because it shocked him, but because it confirmed something he already felt deep in his bones. This wasn't just a response, it was the start of something larger. Barely 24 hours had passed, yet everything had changed. Newspapers across the Americas ran front-page headlines. "A man of dignity silences hatred with truth." The new face of moral courage, Denzel Washington. From actor to advocate, without even trying. On social media, the hashtag had "Thank you Denzel" trended globally for more than 18 hours. Then something else happened, something even more personal. A group of Black American students studying in France posted a short video. Their voices trembled as one of them, fighting back emotions, said, "We've been looked down on for our hair, our skin, our voices. But yesterday, for the first time in a long time, we felt like someone stood up and said, 'We are worth listening to.'" The video exploded across platforms. It was shared by artists, journalists, even mayors and senators. And soon more voices joined in. Young migrants in Canada, Caribbean nurses in London, children of refugees in Germany, Black filmmakers in Brazil. They all told their own versions of the same story, about how Denzel's speech had restored something they thought they'd lost: pride, without fear. But Denzel still didn't speak, until 2 days later, when a single post appeared on his official account. No video, no press release, just a photo. Him standing with his back to the ocean in Mount Vernon, wind brushing against his shoulders. Below it, one line: "Never underestimate those who love their roots. Through them, they become stronger than the mighty." No hashtags, no names, but everyone knew exactly who and what it was about. And then came the call. An international human rights organization reached out to his team. They wanted to invite Denzel as a keynote speaker at a global summit on racism and xenophobia. Not because he was a celebrity, not because he was an activist, but because in one unplanned speech, he had done more to awaken global empathy than most politicians do in a lifetime. Denzel's response was quiet, simple, and full of intention. He accepted the invitation, but set a condition. He asked that 3 young people from underrepresented Black communities in the U.S. be allowed to join him on stage. He didn't want to stand alone. He didn't want the camera to point only at him. "My voice," he told the organizers, "is no more important than theirs." Because what began as a spontaneous act of integrity was no longer just a viral moment. It was becoming a movement, a symbol for millions who had never held a microphone but had everything to say. The International Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia took place weeks later in Geneva, Switzerland. A solemn gathering. Diplomats, activists, survivors, policymakers, tough speeches, hard truths, painful testimony, promises of reform. But amid all the voices, one name stirred the most anticipation: Denzel Washington, the actor who had become a voice of conscience, not by design but by principle. And just as he had promised, he did not walk in alone. He was accompanied by 3 young Americans. Aliyah, a high school student from Detroit who worked part-time as a cleaner and carried herself with quiet courage. Marcus, a 19-year-old barista from Birmingham who had never left his home state until that week. And James, a student from a Native heritage community in Louisiana who rarely spoke but whose eyes held generations of stories. They weren't polished, they weren't media trained, but they were real. And Denzel knew that was the only credential that mattered. When Denzel took the stage in Geneva, he wore no tailored suit, no designer watch, just a simple white shirt with subtle African patterns stitched at the collar. No tie, no flair, just presence. And presence, it turned out, was more than enough. He walked to the microphone, calm and grounded, and raised his hand before the applause could begin. "Before I say a single word," he said, "I want them to speak." And one by one they did. Aliyah, voice shaking, spoke about being judged for how she spoke, how she dressed, how she walked into a room. Marcus shared what it felt like to be followed in stores, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because of the skin he was born in. James, his voice low and measured, told how his entire community had been treated like a statistic, but never asked for its stories. They spoke nervously, but with hearts ablaze, and they all ended the same way, by sharing what it meant when Denzel, a man who didn't know them, stood up and spoke for all of them. By the time the 3rd speaker finished, the room was still. Then, applause erupted, thunderous, honest, uncontainable. Some people stood, others just looked at Denzel standing to the side, silent, letting them shine. And when it was finally his turn to speak, He said something that would be quoted around the world. "I'm not here as a hero. I'm here as a son of a people who were taught never to bow their heads. I just used what I had, my voice." He turned toward the three young speakers, but they're the message. Because while the world saw them as statistics or stories of struggle, they kept dreaming of dignity. A European journalist, veteran of dozens of such conferences, later wrote, "I've covered UN assemblies and G7 summits, but I've never heard a moment so sincere, so disarming, so human." Back in the US, public screens lit up across schools, markets, and even prisons. Thousands watched Denzel and his companions speak, not as a celebrity moment, but as a return of dignity to people who had almost given up hope. When the conference ended, Denzel didn't stay for the gala dinners or camera flashes. He walked out into the cold Geneva night with the three young people beside him. They walked in silence down quiet streets, bundled in coats, processing what had just happened. That night, none of them slept well. Not because of anxiety, but because of the weight of what they had lived. Aaliyah cried softly and whispered, "I never thought a girl like me would speak to world leaders." Marcus, still in shock, admitted, "I almost dropped out of school last year, but now I want to be a civil rights attorney." And James, usually quiet, and wrote a message in a beat-up notebook and showed it to the group. "Today, the world saw us." Denzel didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just smiled, gently, proudly, as if seeing himself in each of them. Because this was never about a single speech. It was never about one man. It was about reminding the world and the next generation that when you defend your people with grace, you don't just rewrite the narrative. You light the way forward. And Aaliyah, the student from Detroit who swept cafeteria floors to help her family, opened her old, tattered notebook and wrote a message for her mother. "Today you heard me, Mom. Today it was all worth it." Denzel listened to the three of them quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice. He just watched them with that calm, thoughtful look that said more than words ever could. He wasn't seeing them as students. He was seeing reflections of who he had once been. A boy with dreams, praying the world would one day see something more than a label. Back in the US, the Geneva broadcast sparked an emotional wave. People who had never followed global conferences were glued to their screens. In barbershops, classrooms, churches, and street corners, everyone was talking. Not about celebrities, not about speeches, but about real people, finally speaking on stages that had never made room for them. One comment went viral. They weren't actors. They weren't diplomats. They were life itself, walking onto a stage where only power used to speak. And then something no one expected happened. From his official account, Kash Patel posted a short message. It wasn't a full apology, but it wasn't indifferent either. "I watched Mr. Washington's speech. I respect his voice, and sometimes you learn when you least expect to." The post sent shockwaves. Some assumed it was written by an advisor. Others said it was sarcasm. But it didn't matter, because the man who had belittled an entire people was now forced to acknowledge their truth. When Denzel was told about the message, he simply smiled. He didn't reply. He didn't boast. He didn't gloat. He wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to defeat anyone. He had already said what needed to be said. And his greatest victory? It wasn't a retraction. It was watching his people walk a little taller. From that day on, murals began to appear in neighborhoods across the US. Not of Denzel holding an Oscar or a script, but of his words, "We don't need permission, we need respect." When you love your roots, you speak from your soul. What began as humiliation had become a legacy. Months passed, the media cycle moved on, as it always does. The world's attention shifted. New controversies, new stories, new scandals. But the memory didn't fade, because what Denzel had given wasn't a moment. It was a message, a declaration of identity, a peaceful resistance, a truth that traveled beyond race, politics, and fame. It struck at something we all carry deep inside: the need to be seen, the right to speak, the strength to stand with dignity when the world tells you to sit down. Denzel returned to the US without fanfare. No press conference, no spotlight. He went back to Mount Vernon, to the neighborhood that raised him, to the streets that shaped him. On one of his quiet walks, a young boy saw him. Wide-eyed, he ran up and asked, "Mr. Washington, were you the one who defended us?" Denzel knelt down, looked him gently in the eyes, and said with a soft smile, "No, we defend ourselves. I just reminded them we could." The boy threw his arms around him in a tight hug, and in that simple embrace, the full meaning of what had happened was sealed. Because greatness isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about loving what you stand for, enough to speak softly and still be heard. From now on, when people look back on that international summit, they won't remember the scandal. They'll remember what came after. They'll remember how one man, with his hands steady, his voice calm, and his heart full, stood before the world and changed the conversation. Not with anger, but with truth. Not with fame, but with purpose. Not with power, but with grace. And so Denzel Washington, already a legend in cinema, became something even greater. A voice for his people, a mirror to the world, and a reminder that dignity never goes out of style. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a comment below. Has anyone ever stood up for your truth the way Denzel did? See you in the next story.